Have you ever taken one of those mandatory online trainings where the narrator technically says all the right words, but somehow your brain just leaves the room? You're staring at the screen, the audio is playing, the course is moving along, and then suddenly you realize you have no idea what the last 3 slides were about. Usually it's not because the content is impossible to understand. A lot of the time, it's because the voice isn't guiding you. It's just reading at you. That's the mistake a lot of course creators make when they hire a narrator. They listen for a nice voice, a clean voice, or a voice that sounds professional. And yes, those things matter. But a nice voice is not the same thing as a good e-learning narrator. Because the voice in your course shouldn't just pronounce the script clearly. It needs to teach. And when it doesn't, even a well-built course can start to feel dull, flat, artificial, or weirdly hard to follow. So in this video, I'll show you how to spot the difference between a narrator who's actually guiding the learner and one who's just reading the script. The 2 narration red flags that can make good course content feel dull or hard to follow. And a simple checklist you can use in auditions so you know what to listen for before you hire. Before we get into the red flags, think about a student studying with a highlighter. At first, it works great. They mark one key sentence, and now that sentence stands out from everything around it. Then they find an important phrase, so they highlight that too. Then a definition. Then a warning. Then maybe an example that feels important. And before long, half the page is neon yellow, which kind of defeats the whole point. Because a highlighter only helps when it creates contrast. It tells your brain, this is the part to come back to. This is the part that matters. But once everything is highlighted, nothing really is. Narration works the same way. A good narrator uses their voice like a highlighter. They bring the real takeaway forward, and they let the supporting information stay supportive. But some narrators highlight the whole page with their voice. Every sentence gets pushed. Every phrase gets polished. Every transition sounds like the big dramatic moment of the course. And after a while, the learner stops hearing structure. They just hear noise. So the first red flag to listen for is a narrator who makes everything sound important. A good e-learning narrator helps the learner hear the structure of the idea. This is the setup. This is the example. This is the warning. This is the step you actually need to remember. So when you're listening to auditions, don't just ask, does this person sound energetic? Ask, can they find the real takeaway? One simple test is to give them a short paragraph where only one phrase is the true point. Don't over-direct it at first. Just listen. Do they naturally bring that phrase forward while letting the rest support it? Or do they hit everything with the same amount of force? That's what you're listening for. Dynamic emphasis. Not big emphasis everywhere. Useful emphasis in the right places. The second red flag is the nice voice trap. This is when the narrator has clean audio, clear pronunciation, and a pleasant tone, but it still doesn't feel like they're actually talking to anyone. They sound smooth, but disconnected. And in e-learning, that matters because learners don't just need the words delivered clearly. They need to feel like the voice understands the lesson, knows what matters, and actually cares whether they get it. That's why teaching instincts matter so much in e-learning narration. A good instructional narrator is not just performing the words. They're turning information into guidance. They know when to slow down, when to move faster, when to emphasize the real takeaway, and when to shift tone because the lesson is moved from explanation to warning or encouragement. I used to take required safety training every year, and honestly, the hardest part was not always the content. It was the narration. The voice was so dry and checked out that it made the whole thing harder to pay attention to than it needed to be. And when the voice sounds checked out, the learner checks out too. This is also where AI narration can become a problem, but not because learners can always instantly identify it. The better question is, does this voice sound like it understands the lesson, cares about the learner, and knows what to emphasize? If the answer is no, it doesn't really matter whether the voice is synthetic or human. It's not doing the instructional job. So in auditions, listen for warmth and authority. Do they sound like a helpful expert, not a commercial? Listen for conversational phrasing. Do the sentences breathe naturally, like they're talking to one person? And listen for energy match. Are they calm when explaining and more focused when something really matters? So before you hire a narrator, don't just ask, do I like this voice? Ask, can this voice help a learner stay with the lesson? That's a much better question. And there are 5 things I'd listen for. First, dynamic emphasis. Can they highlight the real takeaway without making every word sound important? Second, natural pacing. Do they pause where the learner needs a second to process, or do they read everything at one steady speed? Third, warmth and authority. Do they sound like a helpful expert and not a commercial? You want the learner to feel like the person speaking knows what they're talking about, but also wants them to succeed. Fourth, conversational phrasing. Does it sound like they're talking to one person, or does it sound performed? Tiny imperfections can actually help here, because real people don't speak in perfectly polished rectangles. They breathe, they shift, they make the sentence feel alive. And fifth, energy match. Are they calm when they're explaining something simple and more focused when something truly matters? The energy should not be pasted on top. It should come from what the learner needs in that moment. And once you find a narrator you like, the next step is knowing how to direct them. Because even a good narrator still needs to know what the learner needs in that moment. The good news is you don't need fancy voiceover language for this. You just need clear, simple direction. Here are a few direction notes I'd keep handy. If the read feels too polished or announcer-like, say, make it feel like you're explaining this to one person on a Zoom call. That usually pulls the performance back into something more natural and human. If the narrator is emphasizing too much, say, underline the key phrase and let everything else be supporting. That helps them stop treating the whole sentence like the big moment. If you're not sure about the energy level, ask for options. Give me 2 takes, one calmer, one 15% more animated. That little 15% note is helpful because it gives direction without making the read feel huge or fake. And if the main takeaway is getting buried, say, add a short pause before and after the main takeaway sentence. That pause can do a lot of work. It gives the learner a beat to realize, okay, this is the part I need to remember. That's really the goal of good direction. You're not just telling the narrator to sound better. You're telling them what the learner needs. Because when the direction is tied to the learning, the narration becomes part of the instruction instead of just a layer of audio sitting on top of it. So when you're listening to auditions, don't just ask, is this voice pleasant? Ask, would I want this person walking a learner through something that actually matters? Because that's the real test. A good narrator is not just reading clean words into a microphone. They're helping the learner follow the lesson, notice what matters, and stay mentally connected long enough for the course to actually work. But even a great narrator can only do so much with a lesson that's overloaded. And one of the best ways to make that lesson easier to follow is to make it smaller, clearer, and more focused. So if you want to see how shorter lessons can improve focus, reduce overload, and help learners actually remember what they're learning, click right here to watch my next video on the benefits of microlearning.